The forest was still asleep when the first light of morning slowly touched the tops of the trees. A thin layer of mist floated between the trunks, drifting quietly above the damp ground. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of soil, leaves, and wild plants. There were no roads, no buildings, no signs of human life, only endless trees stretching toward the horizon. In the middle of a small clearing, a young girl stood alone. She carried a worn backpack on her shoulders and held a simple axe in her hand. Her clothes were dusty from the journey, her boots covered in mud. She did not speak. She did not hurry. She only looked around, observing the land as if she were trying to understand its hidden language. This place would become her world for the next 30 days. She walked slowly across the clearing, stepping over stones and roots. Every sound seemed louder in the silence. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the gentle flow of water somewhere nearby. She followed the sound of the stream, moving deeper into the forest. After a long walk, she found a narrow stream winding through the trees. The water was clear and cold. She knelt down, touched it with her fingers, and watched it flow between the rocks. The stream meant life. It meant she would have water. She continued exploring the area, paying attention to the height of the ground, the direction of the wind, and the position of the sun. She avoided low places where rainwater might gather. She searched for a flat, safe spot that could protect her from floods and strong winds. After hours of walking, she stopped on a small hill. The ground was firm and slightly elevated. Sunlight reached the area in the morning, and the stream was not far away. She stood still for a moment, looking around. Then she planted a wooden stick into the soil. This was the place. During the first day, she began clearing the land. She cut tall grass, removed bushes, and pushed aside fallen branches. The work was slow and exhausting. Her hands became dirty, her arms tired, but she did not stop. With every movement, the shape of the clearing became clearer. By the time the sun began to set, the land looked different. The wild plants were gone, and the ground was more open. It was still rough, but it was no longer untamed. As darkness fell, she built a temporary shelter using branches and leaves. She gathered dry wood and started a small fire. The flames flickered in the night, casting long shadows on the trees. She sat beside the fire in silence. The forest at night felt different. The air was colder, and strange sounds came from every direction. Insects buzzed, leaves moved, and unknown. Animals passed through the darkness. She felt small in this vast wilderness, but she did not show fear. The next days followed the same rhythm. Every morning, she woke up before sunrise. She drank water from the stream, ate simple food, and returned to the clearing. She marked the positions where the pillars of the house would stand. She measured distances with simple tools and her own steps. Then she began cutting trees. The sound of the axe echoed through the forest. Each strike required strength and patience. The trees were tall and strong, and they did not fall easily. She swung the axe again and again, her movements steady and focused. After many hours, the first tree finally began to crack. With a loud sound it fell to the ground. She stood still, breathing heavily, looking at the fallen tree. It was no longer just a tree. It was the first piece of her future home. Day after day she continued cutting trees. She chose straight trunks and avoided rotten wood. She cut the trees into long logs and removed unnecessary branches. The forest slowly changed around her, not violently, but carefully, as if she were borrowing materials from nature rather than conquering it. The hardest part was moving the logs. The wood was heavy, far heavier than her own body. She tied ropes around the logs and pulled them across the ground. Sometimes she used stones and sticks as levers. Sometimes she dragged the logs inch by inch, stopping often to rest. Her hands were sore, her back hurt, and her clothes were soaked with sweat. But she kept going. By the end of the first week, piles of logs appeared near the clearing. The empty land began to look like a construction site, although there were no machines, no noise of engines, and no other people. At night, she sat beside the fire and looked at the wood she had gathered. the flames reflected in her eyes. In her mind, the shape of a wooden house slowly emerged, still vague, but real. The first 10 days passed quietly. They were filled with silence, effort, and solitude. The forest watched her without judgment, and, somewhere in the middle of that vast wilderness, the foundation of a new life had begun to form. The second phase began when the clearing was no longer empty. Around it, piles of timber lay neatly arranged, silent witnesses to days of hard labor. The girl stood in the center of the land she had prepared, looking at the materials she had gathered with her own hands. The forest remained unchanged, but something in the clearing was slowly transforming. She started with the foundation. Using a shovel and simple tools, she dug holes in the ground where the main pillars would stand. The soil was hard in some places and soft in others. Stones blocked her path, roots twisted beneath the surface, and every hole demanded patience. Her hands became rough, her nails filled with dirt, but she continued without hesitation. When the holes were deep enough, she placed large stones at the bottom. She arranged them carefully, creating a stable base that could support the weight of the house. The foundation was invisible once completed, but she knew it would determine the strength of everything above it. On the next day, she raised the first pillar. The log was tall and heavy, far heavier than she expected. She wrapped ropes around it and used her body weight to pull it upright. The pillar trembled, leaning slightly to one side. She adjusted its position, pushed it again, and filled the hole with stones and soil. When the pillar finally stood straight, she stepped back and looked at it for a long time. For the first time, there was something vertical in the clearing. The first time, the house felt real. Over the following days, she raised more pillars. Each one was a battle against gravity and fatigue. Sometimes the logs slipped from her hands. Sometimes she had to start again from the beginning. There were moments when she sat on the ground, breathing heavily, staring at the unfinished structure in silence. But every morning she returned to work. When all the pillars were in place, she began installing horizontal beams. She built a simple wooden ladder and climbed upward, carrying heavy beams on her shoulders. The wind moved the treetops above her head, and the height made her cautious. She tied the beams with ropes, hammered nails, and adjusted angles with careful precision. Slowly, the skeleton of the house appeared. From a distance, it looked fragile, almost temporary. But from inside, it felt strong. After the frame was completed, she began working on the walls. She stacked logs one by one, fitting them together with patience. The gaps between the logs were filled with clay and moss she collected from the forest floor. Her hands pressed the wet clay into every crack, shaping it carefully to block the wind and cold. Day by day, the walls grew higher. The interior space became clearer. The house began to separate itself from the forest. By the time she finished, most of the walls, her body was exhausted. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned, and her movements became slower. Yet, when she stood inside the unfinished house, surrounded by wooden walls she had built alone, she felt something different. The forest was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. The next challenge was the roof. She prepared thinner, wooden pieces and carried them to the top of the structure. She climbed the ladder again and again, placing beams, adjusting angles, and tying everything together with ropes. The work was dangerous and required balance and concentration. Once the roof frame was ready, she covered it with layers of leaves, dry grass, and wooden boards. Each layer was added carefully, as if she were protecting something fragile. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered above the forest. The wind grew stronger, rain began to fall. She stepped inside the house and looked up. Water hit the roof, running down the layers she had built. For a moment, she waited, listening. No drops fell inside. She stood there silently, feeling the sound of rain outside and the quiet inside the house. The roof had worked. That night, she sat on the wooden floor, surrounded by unfinished walls and the smell of fresh timber. Outside, the forest was wet and cold. Inside, the house was still empty, but it was already different from the world beyond its walls. The second phase was over. The house was no longer just an idea. It was a structure. It was standing, and it was slowly becoming a home. When the structure of the house was finally complete, the forest around it seemed different. The trees were still tall and silent, the stream still flowed quietly through the rocks, and the wind still moved through the leaves. Yet, in the middle of that vast wilderness, something new had appeared, a place shaped by human hands. The girl stood in front of the unfinished house for a long time, observing every detail. The walls were strong, the roof was stable, and the frame stood firmly on the ground she had prepared. But the house was still empty, still rough, still far from being a true home. The final phase began with small details. She started by building a door. Using leftover wooden planks, she cut and shaped them carefully, connecting them with simple joints and nails. The work required precision rather than strength. When the door was finished, she lifted it into place and attached it to the frame. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she pushed the door gently. It moved smoothly and closed with a soft sound. The house was no longer completely open to the forest. Next, she made a small window on one side of the wall. She cut an opening, smoothed the edges, and installed a simple wooden frame. When sunlight passed through the window for the first time, it illuminated the interior of the house with a warm glow. Inside, she began creating basic furniture. She built a bed from thick wooden boards and logs. It was simple and heavy, but solid. Then she made a small table, a shelf for tools and supplies, and a wooden bench. Every piece was handmade, imperfect, but strong. As the days passed, the house slowly gained character. On the following day, she focused on water. She walked to the stream with bamboo tubes and ropes. Carefully, she connected the bamboo pieces, forming a simple channel that directed water toward the house. It took many hours of adjustment to make the water flow smoothly. When the first drops of water reached the area near her house, she stood quietly and watched them. The sound of running water felt like life arriving at her doorstep. Food was the next challenge. She spent days exploring the forest, learning which plants were safe to eat and where fish could be found. Using simple traps and handmade tools, she caught small fish in the stream. She gathered wild vegetables, roots, and fruits, slowly building a basic understanding of the land. In the evenings, she cooked near the house, fish roasted over fire. Wild greens boiled in a small pot. The smell of smoke mixed with the scent of wood and earth. The meals were simple, but they were the result of her own effort. One night, she decided to sleep inside the house for the first time. The fire slowly faded, leaving only glowing embers. The forest outside was dark and full of unknown sounds. Inside, the wooden walls created a quiet space. She lay on the wooden bed, listening. The wind touched the roof. Insects moved through the grass. Somewhere far away, an animal called out. She did not feel afraid. For the first time, she felt protected. The following days were calmer. She cleaned the area around the house, removed unnecessary branches, and created a small open space in front of the entrance. She built a simple wooden chair and placed it outside. In the mornings, she sat there, watching the sunlight slowly enter the forest. Sometimes she did nothing. She only listened. The forest was no longer an enemy. It was a companion. On the 29th day, she added the final details. She hung a small oil lamp inside the house. She organized her tools on the wooden shelf. She repaired small gaps in the walls and reinforced the roof with extra layers of leaves. Everything was ready. On the 30th day, the morning arrived quietly. The sunlight touched the roof of the wooden house, highlighting its rough surface and handmade structure. Smoke rose gently from the fire she had lit for breakfast. She stepped outside and stood in front of the house. Her clothes were worn, her hands rough, her body tired, but her eyes were calm. She looked at the house for a long time, not as a builder, but as someone who had created a place from nothing. The forest around her was unchanged, yet her presence had altered a small part of it. She sat on the wooden chair in front of the house,